Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. It is hard to believe that February is almost in the books and another planting season is right around the corner. So let's dive in to see what is happening in the agriculture industry this week. Kicking things off today over at the State Farm Service Agency, there are several Farm Safety Net Program application deadlines that are quickly approaching. This includes programs like Ag Risk Coverage and Price Loss Coverage, also known as ARC and PLC. While election changes for ARC and PLC are optional this year, if a producer has a multi-year contract but makes an election change, a new contract must be signed. And with the application deadline quickly approaching on March 15th, producers are highly encouraged to reach out to the local FSA office to go over their coverage options in order to ensure that they are covered through any potential market disruptions.
This year, the sign-up has been, relatively slow. We've got a sign-up deadline of March 15th, which is, just right around the corner. And it's something where we've seen, just a fraction of those people that have signed up in the past. And I think part of the issue is that we've seen some upticks in markets that have maybe caused producers to think, well, we don't really need this coverage. But it would be good to be signed up just in case you do need that coverage later on in the year, understanding the volatility of the markets right now. So our plea is to get folks into their county offices and have a discussion with the staff there to talk about their eligibility and get enrolled in the event that they need that in the future.
Beyond ARC and PLC, there are other safety net application deadlines coming up that producers may want to take advantage of. That includes a general sign-up period for the Conservation Reserve Program.
But it's an important one for a state like Nebraska. We've got a general sign up on CRP that was just announced about 10 days ago or so. That sign up runs through March 11th. There are a couple of different steps that you've got to sort of go through for a CRP sign up. So getting into their office more quickly than not would be advisable. We've also got dairy margin coverage program, the FSA offices. That sign up runs through March 25th, and that provides catastrophic coverage for losses and provides greater coverage at various levels for a premium in addition to an administrative fee. So you have two different levels that you can operate under. And then there's the non-insured assistance program. That program sign up also is the deadline is on March 15th. This is additional financial assistance for non-insured crops. These are crops that you can't get commercial crop insurance for. So it's a very important tool for those people that grow, things like fruits and vegetables, millet, oats, dry peas, etc. So that is it's a really important risk management tool, and that sign up is occurring through March 15th as well.
To recap, ARC and PLC applications will be due on March 15th, as well as the sign-up period for non-insured assistance program. Beyond that, the sign-up for CRP will run through March 11th, while the dairy margin coverage program sign-up will run through March 25th. If you would like more information on these programs and the requirements to qualify, you are encouraged to reach out directly to your county FSA office, or you can visit the FSA website to learn more. That link is posted at the bottom of your screen now, and of course we'll also share that to the Market Journal website. Moving over to the markets now, we were joined by Mike Briggs of Briggs Feed Yard to discuss the cattle markets. Earlier this week, the U.S. Department of Agriculture reported that the select box beef cutout value was actually higher than choice. The inversion may indicate some price resistance for higher-end cuts of beef. That's where we began the conversation with Mike. Well, let's talk about some of the latest activity in the cattle market. One of the big things a lot of people are watching has to do with the spread between choice and select. What's going on in there?
I've seen the choice select spread go to even several times over my career. I've never seen this. I don't have a good explanation to it. I haven't talked to anybody that has a good explanation for it. I think it basically goes back to simple demand and supply. We've got a lot of choice product. Cattle are grading really well, have been for 2 or 3 years, and we've kind of saturated that market. And you've got another market that buys select as a rule. So I think the choice guys have just got enough product right now. It's also the time of year, and we always have to remember this, it's still January, it's still February. Those are the poorest demand months of the year. We're turning over into March here pretty quick. It's going to warm up eventually, and you're going to see the grills come out of the garage. And then I think that choice product thing goes back up. I think this is a really short-term deal. It might happen for 2 or 3 weeks. I don't think it stays this way, but it is very curious.
You mentioned not a great time for demand, but prices have been steadily going up here in the cattle markets. Give us your general take. What are the bulls and bears in this market?
The bears, very simply, is the amount of cattle on feed. We've had huge placements because of drought, which we're going to talk about later. Have huge placements. Feed yards are full. I am clear full of cattle. I have the most curious situation, and I've had it for 6-8 weeks now. I have a full feed yard, and I have nothing for sale. It's bizarre, and there's a lot of feed yards that are full with people waiting to get in. And so you've got this large supply of cattle looming over the market. So that's going to keep a little bit of a lid on it. But once again, we're coming into the time of year where our biggest beef demand is in front of us. So, and market ready cattle, there's not that many of them. So I'm really friendly to the market right here. Now, the curious situation is going to be, here's what's happening. And this is where people get upside down a little bit. So we've seen the board rally like we typically do. Well, typically that rally ends here, the end of January, February. And you have to remember, everybody's looking at April cattle, which is at that huge premium, like 146, 147 and change. And they're thinking, oh boy, they're getting all geared up. That's telling you what beef is going to be at the end of April, not what it is now. So that's kind of a problem for the guys like me that are hedged. Cash is down here, board's up here. That's a terrible basis. But what you see this time of year is the board peaks and cash starts to go like this. Well, then you get that cash above the board. That's where guys like me are really happy because you're getting money added on, where the guy that saw the board go, how come the board's going down and I'm not making any money? Well, that's why you got to hedge. But that's the situation you see, is the board peaks out and starts to head down, because the board is a futures market. So it's looking way into the future all the time. So you always have that big slob of cattle in May and June. And so the market sees that. So you start to get some of this, but this cash is going to keep working higher here till the middle of April, probably. Typically, that's what it does. So I would say it's going to be fairly typical in that fashion.
Need to give you a compliment this month on Market Journal, Mike. Last month when we talked to you, you were right about the corn market. We were talking about whether it would stay around $6. Well, it's definitely surpassed that. How close are you watching the grain markets in relation to having to feed cattle? And is that a big concern right now?
You have to. That's your biggest variable besides weather, but you can control this variable. So when you buy cattle, you need to lock your corn in, because that's your biggest variable that you can control. So that's really important, and I think this corn thing is going to stay this way for quite a while. If you've looked at the 90-day and even the entire summer forecast, it does not bode well for those of us in the Midwest. It looks dry. So you've had a drought and a poor crop in South America. You've got conflict going on in Ukraine, which is your number 3 corn supplier. If the Black Sea gets blocked off, the only game in town is the United States of America. So you're going to see a lot of demand come after our corn. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the Northern Hemisphere to raise a crop. And it's going to put a lot of pressure to grow a lot of acres of corn. And the farmer's looking at $16 beans. So it's like, well, I don't know, maybe I don't need to plant any corn. So corn's got to fight that and keep moving up towards beans to narrow that gap to buy acres. Okay, next thing, is it ever going to rain? You know, I'm one of the guys that smarts off all the time and says, don't worry about a dry winter. It rains the second week of April, it'll all be fine. Look at the forecast, that's a little iffy. And it's really frightening. And the other thing about that is, if you keep continuing drought, not only does it make your corn price go up, feeders and cows are going to have to get moved off grass because there's no feed. And it's potentially really serious, this market, and it really concerns me, because I don't want to see ranchers go out of business. I don't want to see ranchers struggle, but man, they're staring right down the barrel of a big gun right now.
Final word is yours this week, Mike. We've talked about when you buy cattle, you got to buy your corn as well. And last time you told us don't be a drunken sailor out there buying cattle. What else would you like to leave us with?
You know, I think that situation continues. I think you need to give yourself some room on marketing. That doesn't mean don't do any risk management. It means be thoughtful about how you do it. I'm still a fan of buying puts and selling calls and setting yourself up a fence, because you don't really know what the long-term implications are, what's going on in the Black Sea right now with Russia. And there's so many variables out there. I think Guy still has to watch what he's doing. But I'm pretty friendly to the cattle market here for another 60, 70 days.
A big thanks to Mike for taking time out of his busy schedule there on a cold day to discuss the markets. As we shift our focus over to the grain markets now, we were joined this week by Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners. The markets did not trade on Monday because of President's Day, but when they opened on Tuesday, a number of factors helped drive the prices higher to start the week. Much of the concern is centered around Ukraine, and that's where we begin the discussion with Jeff. Our grain analyst this week is Jeff Peterson, the president of Heartland Farm Partners. Jeff, thanks for being here today.
You bet. It's always nice to talk to you, Bryce.
Jeff, we're having today's conversation on Thursday. I think it's important that I note that because the situation with Ukraine and Russia is changing by the minute. So I want our viewers to be aware of that fact. As we jump into today's conversation, as we look at that Ukraine-Russia situation, is it the wheat market that stands to rally the most because of this news?
Yeah, it sure seems like what it is showing so far is that the wheat has been strong. It's actually traded strong overnight, traded up limit across the Chicago, the Kansas City, and the Minneapolis exchanges, and we also are trading very strongly during the day session today. Overnight, though, actually the biggest move would have been on soybeans, but that market was not able to hold those, and it's since backed off some from where it would have been in overnight trade. So overall, I'd say wheat is holding up really strong right now.
So we talk about the wheat. You mentioned the soybeans as well. What about corn? What's corn do here?
Yeah, corn's falling along very well. And if you think about it, Ukraine's a big supplier of corn. They make up about 16% of the world's exports. So as you wrestle with that number, there's about 1.3 billion bushels that USDA was counting on exports out of Ukraine. Now, a portion of those have already been shipped, of course, but there's still some of those that have not. And so that's what the market has to wrestle with. So I do still think we see soybeans and corn both follow along with wheat, and at each times might take a leadership role, but I do think we see strength across all three yet.
Something coming out of Ukraine right before we came on this broadcast was the fact that the ports are being shut down. What are the implications? Remind us how important Ukraine is to the global grain supply.
They are very important. If you think about it, it's over 100 million acres of crop ground. And if you just kind of think about the U.S. situation between corn and beans, we've got about 180 million acres, so that gives you kind of a reference point. But as you dig into the deeper what USDA is counting on out of Ukraine for exports, they make up 20% of the rapeseed exports. They make up 9% of the sunflower. Over on the barley side, and think about barley, that can be feed or that can be malt. They make up about 18% of the world exports on that. And I'd mentioned the corn side. And then you get down to wheat, and it makes up about 10% or 12%, of the wheat exports. But when you put a number on that, that's about 880 million bushels. And then the other thing you have to do, though, is that on the wheat side, also include with what's going on with Russia. And between Russia and Ukraine, that's about 29% of the world wheat exports. So I think that's why the market's been given a little more strength over to the wheat side than the other markets so far.
Now, Jeff, as we look at the situation, obviously a lot of folks are focusing on the short-term implications of this, but if we look out even further to the long-term, what could that look like? Yeah,
so as we dig in, we'll start first on the export side. We were familiar with how the Ukrainian government and what their export policy was. If the Russians do go ahead and put a new government in place in Ukraine, we don't necessarily know what their policy will be. So we're not quite sure how that will work in regard to the amount that they'll be exporting out. In addition, we have to think about the time of year, and we're not that terribly away from spring planting. So depending on how long this lasts, this attack into Ukraine depends on what's going to happen to acres, what could happen to yields, will they be able to get all the inputs that they need to successfully plant that crop? So that becomes a longer, bigger concern that we have.
Mm-hmm. And back here in the United States, that kind of plays right into the conversation as we're gearing up for corn versus soybeans. What's going to happen with planting acres in the U.S., though, right?
Yeah, that's almost definitely. We saw a little look at that out of the USDA Ag Outlook. They did lower the corn planted acres from last year to this year, 1.4 million acres. They did increase soybeans, 800,000 acres. As a result, though, it's interesting, did bring down the ending stocks on soybeans, but did raise it on corn. Now, I think we'll see a lot of changes coming as we go down the road on the demand side. upside for both of those. But a couple of the key things that we're looking to take out of those report, not so much the acres, because we know there'll be better acres out of basically the planning intentions report at the end of March, but we'll take a look at those yields. That 181 yield is a trend line on corn, and a 51.5 yield on the soybeans. Those are yields that we'll hold on to and use down the road.
Let me wrap up with this question. Is there any top to the market when we talk about war, Jeff?
Well, right now, I think that's what's happening. We're getting a lot of premium. Overnight, there was a lot of traders that were short traders, had sold the market short, getting out of the market. I wouldn't say there's been any precedent that would say that just because this happened, that necessarily put in a top. I think the events and how things unfold going forward will determine whether or not we saw a top overnight or we need to see another leg higher down the road.
Jeff, a lot of developments here. Thank you for coming on Market Drill to give your take.
You betcha. I always appreciate it. I like talking about the markets with you, Bryce.
Thanks again to both our analysts for their time this week. As always, if you have a question for any of our future analysts, please get in touch with us on social media or email us, and we'll be sure to pass those questions along. Moving on now, one day Nebraska rancher Natalie Kvorak read a negative social media post about the beef industry. She wanted to find an innovative way to get a positive message out there to consumers that farmers and ranchers are working hard every day to produce food for the world. So she grabbed a black Sharpie and wrote her message on a white t-shirt. She said, "Ag is not the problem." Posting a photo of herself wearing that t-shirt got a lot of attention from her followers, especially ag folks who posted in solidarity with that message. You can learn more about Kvorak as well as other cattlemen that are sharing the good news about the beef industry in the February issue of the Nebraska Farmer. What is now time for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Well, Al, we got a reminder of what winter feels like over the past week. How are things looking as we turn to the week ahead?
Well, Bryce, we did have that cool air come in during the middle of the week. That was kind of advertised last week. A little bit, just a slightly bit cooler than was expected. Now, we did see a couple little light snow events, one on Tuesday, one on Thursday. The one on Tuesday essentially gave anywhere from 1.5 inches to 3 inches across areas of the western 1/3 of the state. Highest total I've seen come out of the southwestern panhandle. And then, of course, we had some reinforcing energy come through the state on Thursday. Basically light flurry activity. Again, most areas that I see were less than 1.5 to 2 inches of snowfall. In fact, trace amounts in a lot of locations. Then we started to see the warm up begin yesterday, and it looks like it's going to continue through this weekend and early next week. And then as we get into the midweek time period, we start to look at potential for some slightly cooler air moving in and maybe some more aggressive weather coming in sometime as we get into late next weekend or the following week. So let's take a look at the upper air miles and see what we might have in store. First thing I'll draw your attention to is the cold air that has been inundating our region is now kind of lifting toward the north and the east. We do have a little bit of southern stream energy moving to the Mississippi River Valley region, but there's really not a lot of moisture associated with it, so pretty much high and dry conditions here in the central portion of the country. We'll see temperatures today that'll be primarily in the 40s across northeastern Nebraska to around the 60-degree mark in southwest Nebraska. And tomorrow that ridge starts to expand, brings that warmer air into eastern Nebraska. So everybody should be well into the 50s. And indeed, we probably see 60s widespread across the southern 1/3 of the state. Precipitation stays out in the northwestern part of the country. And on Monday, that ridge base builds to the north, brings that cool air just skirting northeast Nebraska, but more importantly, moves it over toward the Great Lakes regions once again. Temperatures will remain consistently back into the 50s and 60s across the state. No precipitation closer we get is up to the north of us. Now on Tuesday, that ridge starts to build northward, keeps that energy all across the western Great Lakes region and the upper Mississippi River Valley, keeps us basically in that dry conditions, even with the low surface low developing in the Texas Panhandle. Widespread 50s and 60s across the state once again. Now on Wednesday, we may basically start to see some cool air moving to northeastern Nebraska, but looks like conditions will remain fairly warm during the day. The cold air really starts to arrive during the overnight hours. So we're going to be that same old song and dance. So maybe a little flurry activity early in the morning, but overall we should still remain in the 50s and 60s, and that might hold into Thursday, maybe 10 degrees cooler, depending on how quickly this ridge itself moves into the region. Low pressure starts to develop along the front range of the Rocky Mountains, but once again, there's no moisture source for this, so it's basically just a thermal lows developing. On Friday, we start to see that ridge break down. The first piece of energy starts to move across the northern plains. That'll drop our temperatures back to more seasonal normals, back into the 40s to low 50s across the state. Still looks like we're going to be lacking precipitation. Initially, most of it will remain to our south and to our north, but there is a fairly potent storm system coming in, and by the GFS model expected to arrive into our region late in the next weekend, into the early part of next week. And right now, GFS model is being very aggressive with precipitation across the central United States, so we'll wait to see next week whether or not that verifies out. 8 to 14 day forecast takes into consideration that trough coming in and brings that colder air in across the northwestern one half of the country. And in terms of precipitation, with that system sliding in after we get through the first full weekend of the month, above normal moisture and potential for some accumulating snow.
Thanks, Al. Finally, today, spring-born calves are usually reliant on supplementation through the winter months, and that can mean a low rate of gain. It is often assumed that providing mineral protein supplementation to target a pound per day gain during the winter months is the most economical system. However, UNO cow-calf specialist Dr. Karla Wilke tells us supplementing your cattle might not always pay off as well as you might think. Market Journal's Mike Straub brings us this story.
Supplementing calves through the winter for weight gain is a standard practice for cattle producers. An article in the January Beef Watch newsletter, Winter Supplementation of Beef Calves When Supplementation Doesn't Pay, points out that the economic impact may not be what most expect. Assistant Professor of Animal Science, Cow, Calf, and Range Management Specialist Dr. Karla Wilke explains.
So these would be spring-born calves. This would be a traditional system for a lot of producers where they would wean spring-born calves and then they would wean spring-born calves in the fall, and then they would supplement them through the winter. And a lot of times the paradigm is simply to feed them enough protein supplement to get them through the winter. And so that targeted rate of gain a lot of times is half a pound a day gain to a pound a day gain. And the research that I brought out in this article would suggest that that's kind of a waste of money. The research suggested that if you take 450-pound calves or 500-pound calves and you supplement them, one study we took 450-pound calves, supplemented 0, 1, little over 2, little over 3 pounds of distillers grains on a dry matter basis a day during the winter, and got a nice linear response to that. The calves gained a little over a half a pound a day, clear up to 1.75 pounds. Then those calves went to winter wheat pasture. And so that's kind of even in Nebraska, we don't graze a lot of winter wheat pasture, but that's a typical thing that we would then go to a higher quality forage like spring grass. And so basically what that study showed was that the calves that were not supplemented at all during the winter experienced compensatory gain, and they ended up coming off of the wheat pasture grazing or the high quality forage grazing weighing the same as the calves that just got the first level and were just targeted at a pound a day gain. And so basically that expense of that supplement was lost on those calves. However, the calves that were supplemented to gain 1.5 pounds to 1.75 pounds maintained their gain throughout that higher quality forage grazing system. And so that gain was still, that gain advantage, that weight advantage was still there at the end of that grazing.
Research shows that supplementing enough grains to maintain 1.5 pounds a day gain seemed to be the most economical practice, even when the price of feed is increased.
In the meta-analysis of 6 studies that I talked about in the article, those were 500-pound calves that were supplemented in the winter to either target half a pound or 1.5 pounds gain. And in those 6 studies, not only were the cattle followed through in subsequent summer grazing where they had high quality forage, but they were also followed through the finishing phase. And much like the previous study that I just mentioned, what they found was that the calves that were only supplemented to gain half a pound a day, once they got to grass, they only compensated about 37%. So that means that the calves that were supplemented at a higher rate of gain in the winter also finished the summer still in a weight advantage over the calves that weren't supplemented very much. And in all 6 of those studies, that weight advantage was maintained all the way through the finishing period. So supplementing just a little bit to to kind of get the cattle by, as we sometimes say, was a waste of money because they experienced compensatory gain over the summer. But if you supplemented to gain 1.5 pounds or so, then you could maintain that advantage. Economically, that worked out even when distillers' grains was priced a little higher, like it is this year due to some drought conditions and higher corn prices, and in years when distillers was priced lower.
Some considerations when deciding to supplement are the quality of the calf's base diet, how much supplement it would take to make up the nutrients in the base diet, and when the producer is going to sell their cattle.
So what we need to consider when we're deciding what to supplement is the quality of the base diet that the calves are going to be on, and how much supplement it would take to make up the difference in the nutrients in the base diet versus the nutrients they need to gain 1.5 pounds. And then some other considerations would be when they are going to sell those calves. So in the first study that I talked about, the calves that were sold at the end of the dormant native range, the winter grazing, those producers would have made the most money by feeding for those calves to gain 1.75 pounds. If they were to hold those calves over to the summer, then most frequently and in most situations, given a sensitivity analysis of various prices for calves and prices for distillers, the most solid economic decision was to supplement those calves to gain 1.5 pounds during winter range grazing.
If you plan to supplement calves through the winter for optimal weight gain, keeping to the standard practices may not make sense economically. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
Thanks for that story, Mike. If you would like to learn more about this subject, you can find Karla's article on the topic online at beef.unl.edu. We've also taken the liberty of posting a link to that article and the subsequent podcast to the Market Journal website. That is going to do it for this week's show. If you've missed a story, be sure to download that helpful Market Journal mobile app, or of course you can follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. We hope to see you back here next week. Until then, I'm Bryce Tuskett. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.